And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're listening to this audio or whenever you're watching this video. My name is Rafael Vasquez, and this is your show, Líderes del Futuro. And today I have the privilege and opportunity to interview Dr. Luis Zayas, who has been doing a lot of work in regards to issues of suicidal ideation among Latina teens. And so I want to welcome you to the show, Dr. Zayas. And as I welcome you to the show, if you could give us a little bit of information about your level of education and how it was for you to go through all those different steps in obtaining your doctorate.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to talk about a topic that's very important to me, but also is important to our community. My higher education, I was, like many, the first person in my family to go to college. And so I'm very proud of that. I know that it's been very important for my family to do that, to have someone do that. And then from there, I became very enamored of the world of the mind and thinking and thoughts and helping others. And in the background is my granddaughter, so pardon me. But anyway, so it was I knew that I wanted to help people in my career, and so I went on to get a master's in social work and a PhD in developmental psychology, because I really like to watch how people grow and develop and change in their personality forms. And those were all done in New York. I did my undergraduate and graduate in New York after getting there from Puerto Rico.
And so, again, it took you a long time, but you achieved that. You ended up with a bachelor's degree, you ended up with 3 master's degrees, and then you ended up with the PhD, which, again, as a person of color, as an individual who's first in their family to go to college, we know for sure is not easy. And I want to talk about this problem that we have, this huge problem that we have with Latina girls, teens, and again, this ideation of suicide and what causes it. As you well know, in the Latinx community, a lot of our parents, especially first generation immigrant parents, you only go to see a therapist because you're crazy, and we're not crazy, because if you're crazy, then that reflects on my parenting skills, and therefore you're definitely not going to go to therapy. And this is something that just gets passed down from generation to generation. And as a result of that, we know that a lot of girls are suffering in silence. Can you talk to us about, one, why did you choose to do this research, and what is it that you have found out?
Well, it was early on in my career when I was in New York City and working in emergency rooms in the New York City hospitals. And one of the things we were seeing were young Latinas coming to the emergency room following a suicide attempt. And that caught my attention, and it was something I was really fascinated by. Why was it that it was our girls that were coming in greater numbers? And we're talking about the late 70s, early 80s. And that really triggered an interest in me. But when I went to the library and took journals to find out what I could learn about it, there was nothing, absolutely nothing. One study that had been done in late 1950s about Puerto Rican women in the South Bronx, but that was it. And so with that, I began to think more about it, talk to colleagues, write, present, and many years later was I able to then get the financing to do a large study. And so that's really where it started. And it's a concern. It's a concern because why was it that we were seeing so many more Latinas in communities where they were underrepresented, insofar as they were overrepresented in the population that was coming to the clinics, but underrepresented in the local populations, or just kind of average or normal in their numbers within the population. And that began a literally 40-year a journey of learning more and studying.
Yeah, and what I've read, you ended up publishing a book that in 2011 about the same topic. It says Latinas Attempting Suicide, When Cultures, Families, and Daughters Collide. And I think that a lot of your research has focused, again, between the immigrant community, the parents who migrated, and the children who either migrated here at a younger age or were born in the United States, and how suddenly there's like a conflict between the culture of the parents and the culture of the United States that the
Mhm.
children really grew up in. Can you explain to us how that again leads to these girls attempting or planning suicide?
Mhm. Okay. Yes, and I think we have to think about it for your audience. Think about three streams coming together, confluence. And one stream is the girl's own development. That is what happens to youth in general. Teenagers want to become more autonomous. They want to be free. They want to do what they want, and their thinking, their cognition is developing. They feel that they should be more independent behaviorally and emotionally, and so we have that natural progression. The other is that we have the family's own abilities to manage. That's a second stream that's coming to this center. The family's own ways of dealing with their children, bringing up their kids, and the influence of their culture of origin, right, on this, which brings us to the third stream, which is the kind of the cultural background that these parents bring, and that all comes together because the girl is growing up in one culture, the mainstream American culture, right? The parents, in most cases, spent their adolescences back in a home country, Mexico, the Dominican Republic, Venezuela, wherever, and so they have two very different cultural perspectives. And the parents might, in that third stream, be more likely to follow the cultural demands of their cultures of origin. For example, a young lady's virginity, being dedicated to the family and to the home, taking care of younger siblings, all of the things that have been very traditional in Latino cultures for decades, right? And so when you have those three coming together and families are not able to deal with that effectively, you then have the risk of a suicide attempt by the girl when she gets frustrated. So just to give you a typical picture, well, there's not really a typical picture, but the girl's 14. That's the average age. She's 14. She's awakening physically, emotionally, cognitively. She's going to school, being more independent. The kids are kind of further ahead culturally than, say, their own parents. And so there's that influence. Then, of course, she might find someone she likes, same sex or opposite sex. There might be a romance. And then parents don't want her necessarily to have all the freedom that she wants. They don't want her to date. They're saying, no, you have to stay home. And she's saying, no, I need that freedom. And the parents are saying, no, because in our culture, in our family, girls don't do that. The parents are following a certain pattern of socialization of the girls for females in the culture. And that's when we run into the clash, the potential clash, if the parents particularly don't understand how to deal with the daughter. And that's where, it requires a level of flexibility and adaptation or adaptiveness by the parents, where they can understand that their adolescence is different from their daughter's adolescence, two different places, that this is a very natural human developmental stage in adolescence. And that rather than to clamp down on the girl and become rigid about their beliefs and how the girl should act, they need to be more understanding and engage in more communication. And that's really, without that, it could risk the suicide attempt. And often those attempts are pretty spontaneous, impulsive, but they come with a long history of this kind of growing, mounting tension, the girl wanting to be freer, do her own thing, and the parents saying no. And without resolution, that creates the conditions for a suicide attempt.
And you've been studying this for a long, long time. I know that, again, you wrote that book. What have you seen, if anything, in the immigrant population in regards to are we getting better at how we talk with children about, again, those type of freedoms, about learning to develop their own person? Are we not changing at all? Is suicide ideation still a humongous problem? Because to be honest, I am aware of it because I talk and I've been working for over 24 years with youth in this community of Sonoma County, California. But people really don't talk about this stuff. And I will always remember I did a lecture for over 100 parents, immigrant parents. And I remember I did a lecture, this is probably 10 years ago, and I said, you need to talk with your boys about how to be respectful of young ladies, this and that. You need to talk to your daughters about, again, safe sex and everything else. And I remember that a mom raised her hand, asked for the mic, and she said, my daughter is 13 years old. I'm not going to talk to her about sex. She can talk to her friends about sex. My thing was about preventing, what is it called, pregnancy. That's why they should talk to their children, both boys and girls. And the mom was like, I'm not going to talk to her. That's why she has her friend. And it's like, if her friend is as ignorant as your daughter about the issue, what's going to happen? Are things getting better? Are people talking to each other? Are they not talking to each other?
That's a really good question, because it's a hard one to answer, which is why it makes it a good question, because we see different patterns that depending on the parent's level of education, chances are they understand what their daughter's needs are. In our research, we found that parents with higher educational achievement, even high school or just 2 years of college or trade school, had much more information and ways of dealing with their daughters than less educated families. One of the things we found too is that the girls whose mothers worked outside of the home, were employed, were less likely to attempt suicide, and mothers knew how to deal with their daughters, in part because the mothers were outside. And the mothers were hearing from other women and other men at work about how their teenagers are dealing. And so by listening, you hear, oh, that's how they do it in their home. Maybe I'll try that with my daughter. So they bring home a certain information, even though they may not have the education. They've learned from what's out there and what other families are doing. The other thing is that it helps the girl to know that mom is out there working. There's a certain level of modeling that goes on, and a sense of pride that the mother brings, that she can put money down on the table and say, this is my contribution to the family. I think that's really great for the girls. What we still have, though, is the struggle between the first generation, the parents coming with their traditional views, and the child. And, kids will acculturate, they'll adjust to this culture much more rapidly than their parents, right? So and parents are a little slower. The kids move very quickly. And so that's where the struggle is. And for teachers, or counselors, social workers, psychologists, I think what we've got to understand is that, that difference is not just a generational gap, which all cultures have, the parents and the kids, there's always, but we add on top of that a layer of the acculturation gap. Yeah. Our girls, and many immigrant girls, especially from traditional societies like ours, face this hard, kind of this hard second gap. So it's not just one, it's two. And so the parents really have to begin to understand that, they've got to change with the times. What we have learned over time is that if a child if a child is born in the U.S. to immigrant parents, she will acculturate faster. And depending at what age she arrived in the U.S. as a child, as an immigrant child, that will affect the chances of a suicide attempt. Girls who arrive in the U.S. before the age of 13 look more like the girls who were born here and are acculturated or enculturated to the U.S., whereas a girl who arrives at 14, 16 is much more ensconced in her original culture, the Dominican Republic, Venezuela, Mexico, wherever it is, and that they are already more aligned with their parents, and so the risk of a suicide attempt there is lowered. I mean, there are many reasons that kids attempt suicide and think about suicide. It's not just family issues, because there are issues of friends and their own psychopathology. Sometimes kids do have problems. But we have seen the pattern of the suicide attempts among these girls very frequently, although they don't result in death, which is the great thing. But it's just that they harm themselves. They repeatedly harm themselves. And who knows, one day they could make a mistake and die from the suicide, even though they didn't want to really die. One interesting thing about the issue you raised earlier of the mental health issue is that so long as when I was in practice, families were okay with bringing themselves and their families members to me to get consejos.
Mm-hmm.
But if it was for terapia,
Yep.
no way. Because like you said before, terapia implies, that there's an illness, a mental illness. Consejos, well, we get consejos from friends, families, comadres, priests. And okay, so I go to a mental health person who gives me consejos. So, we need as professionals to work with the client where the client is and be able to understand if that's what gets me through to help this family communicate better. You could call it Apple, and that's fine. It doesn't matter what you call it. I think it's the position that we take with respect to our clients and their needs.
Definitely. And that brings me, I am the president of the board of a nonprofit organization, Humanidad Therapy and Educational Services. And one of our greatest developments, I guess, is a very small nonprofit organization that offers therapy or counseling. And one of our greatest developments has been convivencias. Convivencias is just where we bring the food and we just put the food here on the side. And as a result of that, all this, usually we work with people 18 or older, but these families or these individuals show up and then we just call it convivencia instead of therapy, and it's group therapy, but in reality it's just convivencia because they are used to doing that, right? Or families are used to the carne asada, and then we get together and we chismear a little bit. And then when you leave, you feel so much better because you let that stuff out. Or one of the other things that we know from patriarchal societies, like many of ours, is when the husband would go out to work in the field, he's talking to other men about how frustrated they are either with the children, with the spouse, whatever the situation is. And when they come home, right, they are feeling semi-okay. And back in the days when women would go to the river or to the, some other area to wash the laundry, and they would go to with a comadre, with a neighbor, and they would just like wash their laundry next to each other by a rock, and they would talk to each other about, oh, this is the frustration of today and this and that. They would sit there, they would let the clothing dry with the sun and the air. And then when they're walking home, they feel much, much better.
Better.
And so it's that idea, you're right, is about not calling it therapy, because therapy is definitely not something that people feel very comfortable with. But if you just call it consejería, perfectly acceptable.
Yeah.
And in our situation, again, we call it convivencia. And it's something that eventually we're going to teach people in California, therapists in California, and in other parts of the United States, how to properly conduct convivencias so that Latinx families will be able to get the most out of it.
Yes.
But
yes.
yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense if you just change it, the title, to whatever they want to hear, as long as the work gets done.
Yes.
And
Let me just,
uh-huh.
if I could just interrupt you, I'm sorry, the idea of convivencias, right? To chat, to platicar, right, is so essential. And if you think about the culture where the sense of personalismo is so important to us, right? Rather than a therapist getting right to work, so what's the problem? No. Oh, where are you from? ¿De dónde es usted? And you're finding out, oh, see, I know that market. Oh, yeah, I've shopped there before. You're building a personalized relationship. Then you can be engaged, and then with personalismo, and that comes confianza, right? The trust. Now I can trust this person because I have a sense of who he is. I know he's a father, he's a grandfather, she's a mother, whatever the case might be, but you know something about the person. It's so important. And for too long, American psychotherapy always had the idea of the blank screen.
Yeah.
The therapist should not be an actor in the process, but rather an anonymous. And that doesn't work for people who live under this value of personalismo. It's so important.
Yeah, yeah, and again, I think that some schools that prepare or train future therapists still don't do the right training in being able to say, if this is the population you choose to work with, you're going to have to also release some of your information. Yes, I'm married. Yes, I have children. Yes, I live in your own community. Therefore, we share these commonalities. Let's work together on making sure that you're going to be a successful member of the community.
Yes.
Um, Going back for a second, you talk about what is it called? Enculturation. I usually talk about enculturation, deculturation, culturation, and the fact that as long as we are people of color with darker skin, we'll never be able to assimilate. When I teach my classes at Santa Rosa Junior College, in your book, do you cover some of those issues as part of the difficulties between parents and children?
I do cover it, and in general, we have to think about what the challenges are for our kids, depending on how they look, the color of their skin, the hue of their skin, right, the texture of their hair, all of that makes a difference.
Yeah.
And I think that we've got to take into account in the work with our young ladies and young men, because there's a lot that comes back at them from the world that they don't want to receive, the discrimination, the rejection, the so-called microaggressions, all of those things that go on. And even the lack of expectations from teachers. Oh, go to the junior college. You're smart, but don't go up to that big college because you can't make it there. All of those things I think we're having to deal with. But now, where you and I are now talking through this online means, I think we have to think and talk about what the pandemic has done to the young adolescent mind, right? Here in a stage in life when they want to break open, right? When they want to express themselves, dress the way they want, do what they want, they are now being told you've got to stay home for health reasons. And I think we are at a moment in history where it's the mental health of our kids is especially precarious, all right? And if you think about the majority of Latino families who don't have the means for a large home and lots of Wi-Fi and game this and game that and yards that kids can spend countless hours in, I think there we have a greater danger in what is happening or what is being caused by the lockdown, this pandemic. So we've got to be extra, attentive to that situation.
Yeah, and again, for me, it's important to have this conversation on the day that is World Suicide Prevention Day, which is the 10th of September, because I'm seeing it on a regular basis. I work with youth, both high school and college age youth, and again, the level of depression that we are seeing with them. They just some of their questions about how much longer is this going to take? And the answer is we don't know. And we cannot allow politics to dictate how long it's going to take. It's going to take however long it's going to take. The issue for us at the moment in Sonoma County, California, again, is we have the pandemic, but we have the fires.
Yes.
And 2 days ago, we had an earthquake. It was a small earthquake, but still, again, it just keeps adding and adding to this thing. And then, so we say to the youth, as you said, stay home, don't go outside because there's all this crazy stuff happening outside. And
Mhm.
then they say, but the fires might get to you. So you might end up having to go outside. So come up with plan B where you're going to be safe well when you go outside. And then again, it just adding and adding and adding. And I go back to the cultural piece. Girls don't talk with their parents. And so here is where I come to you and say, what are your suggestions as to how parents can begin conversations with their youth, boys, girls, about, feelings and, how do you engage into that dialogue with kids when
Mhm.
maybe as a first generation immigrant, you're not used to going and hugging your boys, hugging your girls after a certain age. I know, and I speak about this on my own book, about the fact that fathers, often after the age of 6 or 7, they don't hug their boys, they don't give them kisses on the cheek because it might turn them gay. Um, how do you now re-engage with your children?
Okay. One of the ways that we have found as therapists over the years is storytelling. And I'm talking about making up stories. I'm talking about children learning who their parents are, who my parent was as a child, what he experienced, what she experienced, but not in a way that, oh, when I was a kid, not in that sort of scolding, teaching manner, but rather, oh, yeah, let me tell you about when I was your age, about that time, where we can the child begins to have a sense of their own personal history, like a family history. And that's so important to have those connections, because children need to know who they came from and who their ancestors are or were. And I think that's really important. So families can do that. We found that in our study that there was a scale that had six steps, and the highest step was the best. So with every one step of improved communication among a mother and a daughter, the chance of a suicide attempt was reduced by 50%. And it's almost obvious. The better connected kids are to their families, the better outcomes they have. But we had to prove it through research. And I think that's what I would talk parents. It's not about telling your kid, no, I gotta say so, that sort of thing, but rather, well, let's talk. And how about you, Mija, and really engage, not in a punitive learning sort of way, but this is my story. And I think, kids will respond to that. The other thing that's so important are family rituals. All right, we need rituals in our lives. And it's not just, every Thursday night taking out the garbage. That's a routine, but a ritual that says, okay, every Sunday we're going to gather together at 4 p.m. Luciano over there is going to set the table. Petra over here is going to help mom with this or that. And dad's going to do this. And it tells, a kid that this is important to us. This tells the world, this is who we are as a family. And I think in the migration passage, many of those rituals are lost. And in another time, we'll talk more about detention and deportation and what happens in detention when all of those rituals are taken away from families. And I think when we re-engage children in those kinds of rituals, this is my family. This is who my mother was. This is who I am. I think that kind of storytelling and communication can do a lot of preventive work, and not just preventive, but healing after an attempt.
Yeah, one of the things that I started as a result of a colleague originally started it, and then with a group of people she works with, which tend to be migrant, and then I created my own version of it. And because of the pandemic, we're doing Lotteria Night, and I don't have family of my own. So I open it up, and I think I have like 12 families every Wednesday in this room from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. I come up with gifts. People give me gifts for them, and then for an hour and a half. And at first, it was interesting because it was just adults, and eventually some kids showed up. A kid named Kevin. Now we even name a gift after Kevin. And so he feels very involved. And now we have kids as young as 7 playing Loteria with us. And they get frustrated just like everybody else when they don't win. And they get super excited when they win. And as soon as I finish, I get in my car and I go and deliver all those gifts throughout the city. And they are so excited when they open the door and they're like, here's your presents. And they're like, oh, thank you. I'll see you next week for Loteria. And I remember, right, that with my father and my mother in Mexico, decades back, we did have a family night. We may have had a lot of trauma growing up and everything else, but one night a week, we either play some type of card game or we play dominoes or we play something else. And you're right. I think that this is how you bring them. It could start with a game that leads to a discussion and it goes back and forth. How was this? How was that? Rather than sitting the kids down and kind of forcing them to do something, this could be
Yeah,
something that develops into a healthy interaction with them.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. I think that's very right.
Yeah, good. Any final comments? I want to remind people that a couple of things. One, your book is called Latinas Attempting Suicide: When Cultures, Families, and Daughters Collide. It was published in 2011 but it's the work that you've always been doing. I also want to remind people that if you know somebody who may be suicidal, always, and I always tell people this, write the 1-800-273-8255 number, posted in large numbers and letters on the fridge, in their bedrooms, whatever it is, and just tell them that you love them. It could be an adult, it could be a child. Again, 1-800-273-8255. Any other final recommendations?
No, I would only say in parting is that I think, like any journey, it starts with a first step. And with families, it's that first conversation. It's hard. It might be hard to open up that conversation, the communication, but that first step can be the first one in a long journey.
Definitely. Thank you. My final comment to you all is the English version of my book, Fulfilling the Dream, a guide for immigrant parents living in the United States. The English version should be ready at the beginning of October. And letting you know that as part of that, I created a journal for adults and a journal for youth that should be coming out. You'll be able to get it on Amazon and other major stores. This is where it's a little bit of a guiding journal where on the seventh day, you'll get a little bit of direction, a little bit of, again, an ability to check in with yourself. And I do that multiple times throughout the process. So again, that should be ready starting the week of the 15th of September. And with that, I want to thank you for taking the time and being with me today. I'm grateful for all the work that you've done, and I'm grateful for being able to talk to somebody who has dedicated so much time to try and understand and then educate people about something that, again, people are not willing to talk about, but that we must talk about. Again, Dr. Zayas, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much.